Welcome back to one more installment of our series on who is your neighbor, or who is our neighbor, or who is my neighbor. And the idea behind the series we've had for 5 or 6 weeks now is somebody walked up to Jesus and said, what's the most important thing? If we are trying to live our Christian lives in the way I think we ought to, that's the question of all questions. Somebody asked Jesus directly, what is it we need to be about? What is it we need to be doing? And what they said to him was, what Jesus said to the person who asked was, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. The first one kind of makes sense. The Old Testament is clear, love God the way that we should. And I think the Old Testament, New Testament, all of those, just as clear on the second one. So somebody might have responded, a disciple or something, that the most important thing was to love God and leave it at that. But I think all of the Bible and all of Christianity and all of the message of the Bible is about combining those two. If we do love God well, then we're going to love His people well. And that's been a theme connected from the very beginning. So I want to look at that. We're not going to look at an example in the Gospels like we've been doing, or some of the other things like we spent last week in Romans. Instead of that, I want to go back to the beginning and see some people, somebody mentioned to me one time, and again, just offhanded, if you read the Ten Commandments and say consolidate that into one, most important. Reading the first few, you would say, obviously, love God is there at the top. Can you read the rest of the Ten Commandments and put into that then this idea of loving your neighbor? And I think you can. So what we're going to do is jump back to the book of Exodus. The book of Exodus is a great book, but then in chapter 20 is when the Ten Commandments are revealed. And so what you'll see is, while I read a few of these, I may disappear for a minute while the screen comes up with the Ten Commandments on them, just so I'll do it full screen probably, so you can see those. And but let's read some together. We're not reading the whole passage, but this is the Ten Commandments as we have them. And the first one is, you have no other gods before me. And that's pretty clear. God is one, and everything else is 2, 3, 4. God is never 2, 3, 4. That's the essence of God being God. And the rest of these, next several of them that talk about our relationship with God, are about putting God first and the different aspects of that. So let's look at those. You shall not make for yourself any carved image or likeness or anything that is in heaven or above or in earth beneath, that is in the water under the earth. So if we're worshiping and loving God as creator, what we don't need to do is then ourselves create something and worship that. Because then if you worship something you create, you're worshiping yourself, because you're the creator of it. If you build a wonderful piece of furniture, for example, or if you build a beautiful house, and somebody comes up and says, oh, that's awesome, then they're praising you in some way. What we want to do is praise God. So he's saying, don't make an idol. Idolatry, anything else that you put in this way is not honoring God. Then you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Okay, so we don't play around with the name of God. We honor him, and that's part of our relationship with God, is that we elevate it and taking that seriously. The world around us takes the name of the Lord in vain all the time, and we need to be different than that. Part of that is our speech is a testimony to our neighbors. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Okay, it goes on to elaborate that God created in 6 days and then he rested. And so our rest, our cycle of rest, honors God and gives us a day off whereby we can worship him. And so the Sabbath is well rooted in the Old Testament there. And the next one I think is a hinge. And I'll explain that by saying this. The first 4 are about our relationship with God. The last 5 are about our relationship with each other. And really, number 5 illustrates that by loving our father and mother, we're really honoring God. And so we're honoring authority, we're honoring, and so in that way I think it is honoring our father and mother honors that cycle of up to God, but then turns around and the focus isn't really on honoring God, the focus is on honoring each other in some way. that being our father and our mother. Why? It's because they provide wisdom. They've lived much longer than we have. And so you think about kids being young and learning all the things of life, and until they reach adulthood, that's the situation where they're supposed to say, hey, to look for somebody wiser than me. And doing that, in that, we also acknowledge that God has wisdom and as our Heavenly Father, and that we're to honor Him in that way. So that's sort of a crossover, but part of it is really honoring God, and part of it really is honoring each other, loving each other, as it were. The next 5, we'll read real quickly, and then we'll get back to full screen here, but it says, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness or lie against your neighbor, and you shall not cover your neighbor's house, or your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that's his neighbor's. What we see from reading this list is really a switch in the Ten Commandments and the law of God. First, we see the ones about loving God, and then we see about loving your neighbor, and that is, and specifically, don't covet the things your neighbor has. It's really lessons in getting along, but it really is how to love well. If you have something and you're loving your neighbor as yourself, and you ask yourself, how would I want to be treated? You would not want your neighbors to covet everything you have and come over and all the time and talking about it and wanting it and being willing to steal, which is number 8. You wouldn't want your neighbor to lie about you, which is number 9. Bearing false witness. You wouldn't want your neighbor to commit adultery with your wife. You wouldn't want your neighbor to kill you. In those ways, it's really kind of defining some steps that are key to loving your neighbor. Honor their life, honor their commitments to their spouses, honor their stuff, and honor the life that God has for them as separate than the life that God has for you. You don't need to go around comparing yourself to everybody else all the time. And so when you look at others and you're loving them well, if you do love with a selfless generosity towards them, it frees you up from coveting and stealing and bearing false witness. Why would you lie about your neighbor unless to elevate you above them? And so to elevate them as yourself, to do both, is to honor all those things. And so I think that if you look at Jesus' words, they weren't new. I don't think he was establishing something. At another point, he says, this a new commandment is you love one another as I have loved you. But in this way, he's talking about loving your neighbor. And so I think that the statement of Jesus to love your neighbor as yourself, again, who's your neighbor? Well, the person that you're around that you could murder. It's not somebody in a far off country necessarily. Somebody who's near you. It even says neighbor in number 10. So we do, I think at all points, from the beginning to the end, and I'm getting ready to read a passage in Revelation, we do see where treating others well is a component of the law of God from the beginning to the end. And so because of that, honoring others is a way to honor God. Honoring God leads to honoring others. Because God, in His own way, was self-sacrificial in the way that He gave to us His only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Him will not perish but have everlasting life, was the ultimate selfless act. And so how do we treat others that way? So I want to I'm big on bookends. I'm big on looking at the beginning and looking at the end and putting something in its place. And so what we have here is Revelation 21. Not the last chapter of the Bible, but Exodus is not the first book of the Bible either. But it's the beginning of the law, and here's the kind of wrap up. And I believe there's a parallel passage to the Ten Commandments in what we see are a list of things that God will not have in the new heaven, that He's creating new. So verse 5 says, He who's seated on the throne said, Behold, I'm making all things new. So this is God talking. He says, write these things down. These words are trustworthy and true. We've set up the New Jerusalem. Some people are going to get in, some people aren't. And he says, it is done. Okay, so the establishment of the new home, the New Jerusalem, the new Eden, if you will, the new dwelling place of God is finished. He just used those words to talk about judging those who He's destroying, or being destroyed in that way. And so it's interesting that he uses the phrase that's done a couple different times. But also Jesus on the cross, it is finished. And so we have these kind of parallel sayings that make them rich and deep in their meaning. He says, I'm the Alpha and Omega, meaning the beginning and the end. That's what we're doing. We're looking at the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give from the spring of the water of life without payment. Really, literally saying to those who are thirsty for him, which is Jesus, which is the groom in this story, and we're the bride as the church. And again, it's part of the image is Jerusalem is the bride, but that's us gathered together as the church. He said, verse 7, the one who conquers will have this heritage, and I will be their God, his God, and he will be my son. But as for the cowardly, and I think this is specifically a reference to those who don't want to go through any kind of persecution, because even Jesus said persecution. Of course, the book of Revelation is full of it. The faithless, it's really Jesus, from the beginning was showcasing faith, and we saw that in the centurion, in the woman who touched the hem of his garment. So he wants us to stand up and be strong and follow to the end to be conquerors. The detestable are those who have chosen outward of that. And he gives this list. As for the murderers, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, liars. What do we have? Murderers was number 6. Sexually immoral was number 7. Sorcerers is not in there per se, but it is a choice away from God, perhaps even related to no other gods before me. So number 1, idolaters. So it was number 2, right? Liars, number 9. This is a parallel passage. These are the people who have chosen not to follow God and God's plan, but to follow against God and God's plan. And you notice there's 2 things really in there. There's some of them are how we responded to God, idolaters and sorcerers, and there's some who have responded not well to God, but not well to their neighbor. The liars and the murderers and the sexually immoral. And so you have both of those lists of people. The people who have not loved God well and the people who have not loved their neighbor well. And he says their portion will be the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. And so what he's saying there is that the people who have chosen against God will be eternally separated from God. That's the idea. And we can talk about judgment, and we can talk about all these other aspects, but basically he's saying the people who want to be away from God are going to get that. And it's their choice. We have a choice too. Even here, one of the scriptures right around this, Jesus, and many times the book of Revelation says, "Come, to those who are thirsty, come." And all you have to do is drink. There's a choice that we have. Even as Christians, there's a choice that we have to live an ongoing life of faith. Not just to make a one-time decision of belief. The faithless description is there in verse 8. But cowardly, those who don't finish. Detestable are those who picked otherwise. So as Christians, we need to finish strong. The imagery there of a conqueror is true. We need to finish strong, and we need to conquer. That means we don't quit until we've won. We don't quit until it's finished. We don't quit until it's done. Those are the words of God. And so it's a lifelong commitment to faith, a lifelong commitment to God, a lifelong commitment to follow the rules of God, the heart of God, the commandments of God, which are to love God and love your neighbor. And again, we can go back full circle and say, well, who's our neighbor? And for that, Jesus told a story about somebody who behaved in a neighborly way, who showed mercy, the story of the Good Samaritan. And he switched the question around. He said, instead of saying, this is your neighbor and this is not, which they would have done, he picked somebody who they would have naturally excluded. The Samaritan called him good, or at least that's the way we describe the story today. And he referred to him in good ways, doing good things, and said who was the best neighbor. It wasn't the Levite, it wasn't the priest, it was a good Samaritan. And it was because they acted out on that faith. So loving our neighbor, we could say, in many ways, the list of thou shalt not is a guide. But if we were to change that around a little bit, instead of saying don't murder, how do we become people who go around and give life, speak words of life to people, share Jesus, who said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. I've come that you might have life and have it more eternal. So how do we become people who Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, you've heard it said, but I say to you, and he's changed it up. So I might say to you, you've heard it said, don't murder. I say to you, go out and share life. You've said, heard it said, don't commit adultery. I say, hey, honor the commitments of others, the life that they have. and actively try to support other people in their relationships instead of destroying those out of selfishness. You've heard it say, "Thou shalt not steal." I say to you, blessed is he who gives than he who receives. It's more blessed to give than receive. It took me a minute there. Again, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. What if you spend your time loving your neighbor, lifting them up? You've heard it said, "Don't covet." I say, hey, give more. Your neighbor gets something nice, and buy an accessory for that for him and celebrate with him. We talked about that. Being able to celebrate with those who are going through good times frees your heart. It's really not about, loving your neighbor is really not about not crossing the line into sin, as much as it is, yes, being positive and crossing the line into a blessing and loving and caring for and showing mercy. We rarely see evidence of anybody in the Bible having mercy. We see evidence of them showing mercy, if that makes sense. I say it's rare to see somebody who has love for somebody. It's much more common or natural to see somebody who's showing love for somebody. And so that's the case. Go out and love your neighbor. Do likewise. And so I wanted to kind of just this last week, and next week we'll be on to another study and doing something else. But I've enjoyed this. Jesus' command to those who had asked him, "Who's my neighbor?" And he said, "Well, who was a good neighbor?" And they saw us this guy who's a Samaritan. Jesus' last words to them were, "Go and do likewise." And so I would just say to you, find opportunities to love. Find opportunities to give, find opportunities to show mercy, find opportunities to give life and speak words of life and lift people up and honor people. And, we have a lot of work to do because there's people who are choosing the opposite of that. Murderers and liars and the people who will be separated from God because they don't choose God. But if we do choose God in the story, we need to act that out, not just say, hey, it's in my heart. But live in such a way that people know what's in your heart based on your actions. And so I would encourage you just to do that. Go out and love your neighbor well. And look forward to the next week where we start a new study. And until then, I'm praying for you and God's blessings upon you. And we'll see you next week.